Hello everyone, and welcome to our module on motor learning. So, in talking about motor learning, it's important to think about how much we value motor learning as a society. And one example of that is sports. And this is a drawing from 2025 of the top 10 highest paid athletes in the world. So you probably recognize some of the faces in there. I won't try to name all of them. Now, they made a combined $1.4 billion in 2025. So if we just think about in terms of money, we obviously value the contributions of these individuals because we as a society, allow them and contribute to their financial well-being. Now, 1.4 billion is a ton of money. It's hard for me to put that in context, but one way I thought I could is I found the median home price in Lubbock. Now, this was back in 2025, and the median home price in Lubbock was right about $250,000. So if we took that 1.4 billion that those 10 athletes made, together they could buy 5,600 homes, or median priced homes in Lubbock. Some would be more expensive, some would be less expensive. And that's a lot of houses. And I looked up, well, how many houses are there in Lubbock? And I guess this is, I can't remember if it was the city or the county. It might just be the city. There were about 55,500 homes. So that means that those 10 individuals could buy 10% of the homes in Lubbock. And that's just, 10 of the most well-paid athletes. Now, it's not just athletes that we value the motor skills of. There's, musicians, dancers, but there's also tradespeople, craftspeople, and we encounter them in many walks of life. We have, a carpenter who, of course, their motor skills need to be very advanced and sophisticated. Pilots, occupational therapists, physical therapists, a mechanist, an auto mechanic. They're working on your car. They need to know what they're doing, how to, use the tools, and a chef. Another type of motor skills. So motor skills are valued highly, kind of across society. Maybe not always as much as, say, LeBron James, but lots of people, their careers are dependent on their motor skills. And we're going to look at, well, how can we learn these skills? And there's lots of suboptimal ways to learn. If you have all the time in the world, you could learn anything, even in a very inefficient manner. But time is always limited. We only have so many hours a day. We're only going to live so long. So typically, we're trying to optimize motor learning. And that's what this module is really about. What is the best way to learn so we can learn as quickly and as efficiently as possible? And that's valuable. So, pilots, if they can get through pilot school in 4 years instead of 10 years, that's a good thing. And then athletes, if the quicker they can progress their skills, the easier they can, beat their competition. So in regards to the context, we're typically trying to optimize our learning. We want to learn as efficiently as possible. And that, I think, is also the case when we talk about studying. So in all of your courses, you need to learn material, and cognitive learning or learning material is different than motor skills, but there are parallels, there are some principles that overlap, and we'll talk about those as we come to them. So what is motor learning? At first, this sounds kind of simple. Motor learning, sure, that's learning motor skills, fair enough. And it sounds kind of easy to measure that. But we're going to see that there's a specific definition of learning, and this kind of helps us determine what counts and what doesn't count as learning. And this will also lead to how we need to test your motor learning. And that is not as straightforward as it might seem at first. So motor learning is a set of processes associated with practice or experience leading to relatively permanent changes in the capability for movement. So just one sentence, but fairly dense. This is key to this module. That's why we've got a star on this slide. And I like to argue that that definition is jam-packed full of goodness, so we need to unpack it. And more specifically, we're going to break it down into 4 parts. So we're going to break that sentence down to 4 parts, and we're going to talk about the implications for each of those to motor learning and how we test learning. So first off, motor learning is a set of processes. Now, we've seen cognitive processes already in this course, so information processing was an example of a set of processes. Now, I'm not arguing that information processing is exactly what happens during learning, but what we're saying is that we need to think about the cognitive psychology of learning. And a reason for that is we don't know very much about the neuroscience of motor learning. So if you took me, just an average individual with average basketball skills, and put me in an MRI or fMRI scanner and told me to think about basketball, we could record that, and then we could get an NBA player. Let's get Steph Curry, and we put him in an fMRI and we say, okay, think about basketball. Well, the interesting thing is we're not going to really see any differences between our brains or our brain activity. So the neuroscience of motor learning is limited. It does have its uses. And, well, one example of that is if we get to the simplest type of learning, how 2 neurons learn to communicate, that's called long-term potentiation, and we know a lot about that. We know kind of the cellular steps and how 2 neurons learn to communicate. But if we extrapolate that to, say, learning to play basketball, well, when you learn to play basketball, it's not just 2 neurons that learn to communicate. It could be hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of synapses. And we can't really capture that complex activity with our current neuroscience tools. We are making progress with neuroscience of understanding learning, but it is limited. So in this module, we're going to stick to understanding learning from a cognitive psychology perspective. We're going to think about learning as a set of processes and not as like a set of neural activations, because we just don't know enough yet. Second part of our definition, so motor learning is associated with practice or experience. And what we're going to use this part is to exclude things that don't count as learning. So one thing that doesn't count as learning is maturation. So maturation, you can think of a child as they mature and their neuromuscular system develops. They're going to become faster, stronger, more coordinated. And that's a huge change in their performance. But we don't consider that motor learning. It's distinct. It's maturation. Example here, so if we took 8-year-olds, a group of 8-year-olds and a group of 7-year-olds, and maybe we find a society where people don't play soccer at all. So typically in, say, North America, an 8-year-old would probably have more experience with soccer than a 7-year-old, which is a confound. So let's find people, 7 and 8-year-olds who've never played soccer, and we test them in some soccer drills. They're not going to be very good, right, because they haven't played soccer. But the 8-year-olds will outperform the 7-year-olds because their neuromuscular system is more mature. So that's a difference in performance, but we don't count that as learning. A couple of funny examples. We've got Billy Madison playing dodgeball. If you've seen this movie before, it's kind of a funny scene. And apparently in real life, he actually threw the ball quite hard at these poor little kids who were in the film. And let's just assume that Billy Madison and the kids have the same amount of dodgeball experience. Maybe Billy stopped playing when he was a kid and hasn't played in years. But now that he's a mature, fully grown adult, he's going to be better at dodgeball, not from more experience, but just from maturation. And that does not count as motor learning. A second, maybe more recent example is with boxing. So there was that recent match between Jake Paul and Mike Tyson. To look at my stats here. So when they competed, Jake Paul was 27 and Mike Tyson was 58. Now, there is an increase in your neuromuscular system as you grow up, but there's also dematuration as you grow older. So, as a middle-aged adult, I cannot sprint as fast as I could probably when I was 20, and that's because of the dematuration of my neuromuscular system. So if we go back to this example, now I would say, hopefully not with too much controversy, that Jake Paul, when they fought, was a better boxer than Mike Tyson. Now that doesn't mean Jake Paul could have beat Mike Tyson when Mike Tyson was 27. Mike Tyson would probably destroy Jake Paul. But by 58, there's a lot of dematuration, and that makes him likely a worse boxer than Jake Paul at 27. So those are changes in performance that can occur with maturation, and that is distinct from motor learning. We do study those, but those special years of maturation and dematuration, children, older adults, that is the expertise of motor development, a separate field. Now the next thing that we can exclude, because motor learning is associated with practice or experience, are changes in strength or endurance from physiological training. Again, your performance will improve, but we don't count this as motor learning. A couple examples. So if I go run a mile right now, I'm not a runner, so I would have a very poor time. If I train for a month and run a mile again, I would be better. Now that's probably very little motor learning. It's mostly physiological change. My cardiovascular system has adapted, maybe some muscular adaptations as well, to allow me to run a mile faster. But we don't count that as motor learning. Different example, let's say today, I haven't been working out. I haven't been working out with weights. So if I test my 1 repetition max, say of bench press, it will be very modest. And if I train for a few months and test myself again, it will be higher. That's a change in performance. But on this continuum from physiological change to motor learning, we're going to classify cardiovascular training and weight training. The performance changes there are mostly from physiological change and not very much from motor learning. So as I weight train, my generalized motor program for bench press might get a little more efficient. As I run, my generalized motor program for running might also adapt a little bit and get more efficient. So there would be a touch of motor learning, but it's mostly physiological change. If we want to think of something different, what is mostly motor learning and very little physiological change, an example could be juggling. So if you practice and learn how to juggle, it's mostly motor learning. Juggling, normal juggling probably doesn't require too much cardiovascular fitness, probably not that much muscular strength. So if you learn to juggle and we see performance change, that's mostly motor learning. I try to think what would be in the middle, and it's maybe a silly example, but juggling bowling balls. So here, you'd be learning the basic juggling skills, but there'd also be physiological change. You're going to have to develop strength to be able to juggle bowling balls. So that's something that kind of might fall in the middle. So when we focus on studies on motor learning, we're going to avoid periods of time where there's lots of maturation, children, older adults, and we're going to pick activities where when we see performance change, we can assume it's mostly motor learning and very little physiological change. Third part of our definition, motor learning leads to relatively permanent changes. This is also going to cause us to exclude certain things. We need to exclude anything that causes a temporary change in performance, because motor learning should be relatively permanent. So we call these temporary performance factors, things that change performance but are temporary. So think of changes in behavior that are caused by easily reversible alterations in mood, motivations, or any sort of internal state. These are not motor learning. A few examples here. So here I'm trying to show mood. So let's say you're in a really good mood and we test how good you are at golf putting. Well, you'll probably do better than if we tested you when you're in a really bad mood. But that doesn't mean you've learned or unlearned golf putting. No, it's just your mood. And anything that is easily changed, like mood, we don't count that as motor learning, and I think that makes sense. Motivation, if we're testing you on javelin, let's say, and you're very demotivated, well, your performance will be worse. And again, we're not going to say that is learning. That's just a temporary performance factor. And for internal state, you can think of being very fatigued. So if you're very fatigued, and now I'm going to ask you to juggle for a minute, well, you might not juggle very well, but it's not because of your learning, it's just you're physically tired. So when we measure motor learning, we're going to ignore children, older adults, so we don't see maturation. We're going to pick tasks that are, the performance changes are caused by motor learning and not physiological change. But temporary performance factors are always going to be an issue. And we're going to see the way we minimize temporary performance factors are with retention and transfer tasks, but we'll come back to that in a moment. An analogy for a relatively temporary performance factor and a permanent change. So if you boil water, the water has a temporary change. It goes from water to boiling water. If you then take it off the heat, it goes back to just normal water that's not boiling. So that's a temporary change in the state of the water, like a temporary performance factor. A relatively permanent change, akin to motor learning, is if now we're boiling water but we put an egg in. We put that egg in, after say 10 minutes, it's now a hard-boiled egg. We take the egg out of the water, it cools down, but the egg is permanently changed. And that's the same sort of idea with motor learning. Last part of our definition, and I hinted at this earlier when I talked about fMRI, but motor learning, what we're looking at is this internal capability for movement. Now, this is something that's kind of mostly hidden in our nervous system. It's so complex with the neurons that typical neuroscience tools like fMRI, EEG, TMS have a limited ability to kind of probe our learning. What we're going to do is we're going to look at performance. So, and sometimes that can be very easy. So if you looked at my basketball performance and then you looked at Steph Curry's basketball performance, you'd say obviously Steph Curry has learned more about basketball. But this is going to get more complicated, especially when we're not comparing such distinct and obvious cases where learning is different. The important thing to remember here is that motor learning is not directly observable. What we observe is performance, and that is not necessarily your motor learning per se, because that is something hidden within our nervous system. So the key here to this last part is that we're going to be looking at performance, and we want to make inferences about learning, but performance does not necessarily equal learning. And let me try to drive that home with a few examples. So these are all famous examples in sports where there was a miss that was catastrophic for the game. Actually, I guess not all of them were as bad. So this one, missing an open net. Again, this soccer player here also missed this very open goal. I think that was in the World Cup as well. I forget exactly what happened in the football example. If any of you know, feel free to put that down in the comments. And this one I do remember. So it wasn't catastrophic for the game, but Steph Curry was on a breakaway and slipped. Maybe something was wet on the floor and missed a wide open shot. And it actually got worse because I think Draymond Green grabbed the rebound, shot it, passed it to Curry, who was now in three-point territory, and he airballed the three-pointer. So this is performance, right? Sometimes performance is poor. Steph Curry, as exceptional as he is, sometimes will miss a layup. And sometimes, these other elite athletes will miss an open net. So from that, we can't conclude from, one missed layup that, they've unlearned basketball or hockey or soccer. No, what's happening is that performance that we see is equal to their learning, which is, relatively permanent, plus temporary performance factors. And those are always changing. And that's why we're not consistent and exact, say, like a robot, because there are these other things constantly changing that add into our learning and affect our overall performance. So let's review our definition here. So motor learning is a set of processes. So we're going to look at learning with cognitive psychology tools. It's associated with practice or experience. So we're excluding maturation, we're excluding physiological change. Those are very important and interesting. They just don't fall within the realm of motor learning. Motor learning leads to relatively permanent changes. So we've got these pesky temporary performance factors that we're going to have to do something about. And what we're talking about is some internal capability for movement. So we can't directly observe your learning, which would be convenient. We can observe your performance, but remember, performance is not equal to learning because of temporary performance factors. Let's look at how we would design an experiment to measure motor learning, and we're going to see here retention and transfer tests that are designed to minimize temporary performance factors. So I came up with maybe a silly example, but something that has been done. Couldn't find any research on it, but sometimes there are NBA players who are notoriously bad at free throws. So I think this is Dwight Howard. He was bad, poor free throw shooter. Shaq as well was a poor free throw shooter. And I guess with Dwight Howard, this isn't an AI image. They actually tried at one point, okay, well maybe if you practice shooting free throws, blindfolded, with your eyes closed. And that was maybe an attempt to get him to be better at free throws. So I don't know if this is a good way to train, but we're just going to pretend that this is our experiment. We're going to have NBA athletes. We're going to have half of them train with the traditional method of learning free throws, so go to the free throw line and shoot free throws. And then the other group, we're going to give them this new method where they're blindfolded and will practice free throws. So what we're going to do is we're going to have practice. And in a lot of motor learning studies, I don't know why, but we call this acquisition. But you can think of this as a practice period. And this could be several days. So think of each one of these dots, a different day of practice. And maybe what we're looking at here is, how many free throws do you make out of 100? And this improvement in performance is probably not what you would see in NBA players because they're, already going to be really good at free throws. So maybe let's pretend we're doing this experiment with novices. So they come in, everyone's really bad at free throws. They're not basketball players. And during practice, we see improvements in performance. And sometimes in learning studies, we'll have a score, where the higher the better, or other times we might have error, where the lower, the fewer the errors, the better. So everyone's getting better, which is kind of what we expect. So performance is improving, but we can see this visible difference between groups. The new method, from acquisition, we can conclude that the new method has better performance than the old method. And this is just made up. I don't know if this is what would actually happen. But the key here is that during practice, we can't make a conclusion about which group has better learning because we have these temporary performance factors. It could be, for example, that this group blindfolded, they're like, ooh, we're in the special group, we're in the experimental group. We must be better because we're doing this new and novel thing. That's just one example of a temporary performance factor. It could be that these athletes are, this is the same old thing, and maybe that demotivates them, or they feel less special, so their performance, they have a bad mood, and that affects their performance. Regardless, let's just say that these are the results we find, and we can conclude that yes, the new method has better performance. We don't care that much about performance, though. We want to know who has better learning. And to minimize or eliminate temporary performance factors, we need a retention or a transfer test. So what are those? So first of all, the goal of retention or transfer is to eliminate temporary performance factors. We probably don't ever eliminate temporary performance factors, but we do minimize them, or at least re-randomize them. But we'll assume, to keep things simple, that we've eliminated temporary performance factors with retention or transfer. So retention or transfer occurs after the acquisition phase, and some studies do retention, some do transfer, and in this module we will see one very thorough study that did retention and transfer to check their results as thoroughly as possible. So what is retention? Retention just means that you have a rest period from the end of acquisition and you have one final test, if you will, that's a period of time later. That rest period should be sufficient to have any temporary performance factors kind of dissipate. So if you're, say, shooting 100 free throws, your muscles might be kind of tired. Well, if we give you 24 hours of rest, we say go home, come back in 24 hours, you likely have recovered from that temporary performance factor. So it's most common, I'd say, to see a 24-hour retention interval. There are some studies where maybe a 10-minute retention interval is fine. If your muscles are fatigued, that's not going to be enough. But if you're just bored from doing a reaction time study and we give you 10 minutes off to kind of walk around, come back, well then that boredom, that temporary performance factor, is probably dissipated. But typically we see 24 hours for retention. And when participants come back, we test them on the same task that they did during acquisition. That's retention. Transfer, so instead of a break, what we do is at the end of acquisition, well, instead of giving you time off, we have you do one final test, kind of immediately, but everyone now does the same version of the task. So if we think about our free throws, so I think free throws are from 15 feet. We had one group 15 feet, eyes open, one group 15 feet, blindfolded. Everyone would now need to transfer to the exact same thing. And to be fair, well, maybe we would go, we could stay at 15 feet, and maybe, to be fair, it would be one eye open, one eye closed. It's a little silly, but what we want is both groups who are doing different things now to do the same thing so that we have as fair comparison as possible. The idea that when we transfer you from one task, one version of the task to another, that temporary performance factors will dissipate. So if you're kind of in the zone, you're like, I've got this 15-foot shot. That's why I thought about moving to 10 feet. And then we say, let's go to 10 feet with one eye open. Well, then that kind of in the zone at 15 feet would dissipate. That temporary performance factor is gone. Transfer is not going to be enough if your muscles are tired. You know, if you're tired from shooting at 15 feet, well, 10 feet would be a little easier. But really, in that case, we would want, retention. So retention, transfer, it's sometimes difficult for researchers to know which one to use, which is the best option. And it's not something I'll test you on, but in these studies we'll look at, sometimes we'll see retention, sometimes we'll see transfer. One time we'll actually see both. And the goal is really to eliminate those temporary performance factors. So when we do retention and transfer and we measure performance, the idea is we've eliminated temporary performance factors and we can now say that performance does equal learning, or it's at least the best that we can do. So if we go back to our hypothetical experiment from before, so yes, the new method had better performance, but we want to know who has better learning. So maybe we do a retention test. 24 hours later, everyone comes back in. The new method, still shoots blindfolded. The old method still shoots eyes open. And we now measure their learning with retention. So we're looking at their performance still, but we're going to say that hopefully the temporary performance factors are eliminated, and now your performance does equal learning. And if these are the results, well, we're seeing better learning with the new method. So as a coach, we would recommend, yes, this new method is better, practicing free throws with blindfolded. Now, I haven't found a large study that's actually done this, so this is just conjecture. This is just made up for demonstration purposes. We could do the same thing, but with a transfer test. So immediately after their last day of practice, we say, okay, we're going to do one more block of trials, and let's transfer everyone to 10 feet, one eye open, one eye closed, to be as fair as possible. And if these are the results, we would still conclude that yes, the new method has better learning, and that would be the one we would use in the future. The results are not always that simple and straightforward. So here, this is maybe extreme, but it can occur, and we'll see an example of this later. So here, these are the same results as before for acquisition. So let's go back a second. We're going to conclude that yes, there's better performance with the new method, but who has better learning? That's key. Well, when we look at learning, there's this reversal. So if the white and black dots, the white one's up here at the end of acquisition, but when we get to retention or transfer, whichever one we're using, the results have flipped. Now, why could this happen? Well, maybe, this group doing the new method, they felt special, and that was a boost to their temporary performance factors. But when we get rid of that with retention or transfer, and now we're measuring just their learning, we see this decrease because the beneficial temporary performance factor is now gone. And maybe this group, they're like, we're not special. We have to do the regular old control task. That's diminishing their performance, so, a negative temporary performance factor. When we get rid of that with retention or transfer, performance goes up because that temporary performance effect is gone. And this can happen. And this is one reason it's very hard for coaches to decide, what is best for motor learning. Because they'll often just see performance, and they might make a conclusion that the new method is better, but a motor learning scientist would know to use a retention or transfer test to best assess learning. And here, we'd actually come to the opposite conclusion that the old method actually has better motor learning. Now, I don't want to dwell too long on kind of hypothetical data because it's of limited value, but it's important to understand the reason for retention and transfer tests, and that is so we can assess learning as direct as possible. Let's get to some actual real-world motor learning concepts. So one question that's been investigated quite a bit in the field of motor learning is what should you focus on when learning and performing a motor skill? And I used a track and field example here because there's an interesting study on it. So they asked track and field coaches and athletes at I think it was an NCAA championship. So these are elite track and field athletes. And 85% of the coaches said that they gave their athletes instructions about their body and limb movements. So if we're talking about, let's say a hurdler, maybe the coach says, you need to lift your trailing leg higher. That would be some sort of internal feedback. Now, that's what the coaches tell athletes, but what do the athletes themselves focus on? Well, 65% of the athletes said yes, they focused on something internal, something about their body and their limb as they were competing. And we see this in a wide variety of sports and contexts. There was a similar study in physical therapy, and they found that physical therapists often gave instructions about the body or the limb, and the patients or the clients, they also said that yes, they give me instructions about body or limb, and that's what I focus on. So there seems to be this prevalence for focusing on your body, which we describe as an internal focus of attention. So this is when you focus on the movement of your body. The opposite of this is an external focus of attention. And this is not just focusing on the external world. We need to focus on something task relevant. So it's focusing on the intended movement effects. So let's think about throwing a football. So if I'm throwing a football, maybe I focus on my elbow. And if I'm focusing on my elbow, that's internal focus. That's something about my body movements. Something external would be focusing on how far the ball goes. So if I focus on the flight of the ball, that's an external focus of attention. So both of these need to be related to the task. If I'm throwing a football and I focus on how pretty my hair is, that's not relevant. And if I'm throwing a football and I focus on, the nice sunset in the distance, I guess that's external, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about task-relevant internal and external focuses of attention. So which one is better? And we've already seen, I guess from my intro, that typically coaches and therapists give internal focus of attention instructions, and athletes and clients and patients use those internal focus of intention. So this kind of area of study was largely started by Professor Gabby Wolf, a motor learning researcher at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. Hopefully I got that right. And she was a motor learning researcher herself, and she was practicing windsurfing. And she was trying to learn the power jibe. Now, I don't know what the power jibe is, and this photo I don't think is the power jibe, but she was trying to learn some sort of windsurfing move. And at first she was focusing internally. She was focusing on, her feet, her hands, and she wasn't having any success. And then she said, well, maybe I'll focus externally. And she started to focus on the board or the sail. Hopefully it's called a sail. And she found that all of a sudden she could do the power jibe. And she thought, well, this is interesting. Maybe there's a difference. Maybe it's better to have an external focus of attention. Now, of course, she's a motor learning scientist. She's completely biased. So she said, well, I'm going to design a study to test this in naive individuals, people who aren't motor learning scientists, and we'll see what happens. The other thing she did is it would be very complicated to do this, as a windsurfing experiment. We'd have to, go to the beach. We'd have to have wind. We'd have to have participants, and that's difficult and not as controllable. So she found a way to do this kind of more simply in the lab. This is one of the early studies. There were some before this, but this one I quite like as an example. And what they did for their task is they had people learn to balance on the stability platform. And this is a picture of me from years ago in kinesiology before this area was kind of split into 3 labs. But I did a couple of studies in my early years here on this kind of motor learning and focus of attention paradigm. So this is a stability platform. It's very unstable because it pivots about the middle, and the pivot point is actually higher here than your feet. So it makes it really swingy. So this is a very hard task, and inevitably when anyone does this at first, they're all over the place, kind of slamming between both sides. But we're going to give people practice over 2 days. We're going to do a retention test on a 3rd day. And I said we, but I've done this, and Professor Wolf that's the study we'll look at. And we're going to see how much people improve. So this study, critically, there's 3 groups. Everyone is told to keep the platform in the horizontal position for as long as possible. Perfect performance would be holding the platform like this at 0 degrees for every trial. The internal focus, what we tell participants in addition to this, is we tell them to focus on your feet and try to keep them at the same height. Pretty straightforward. Now they're focusing on their feet, so that's part of their body, so that's internal. For the external group, we tell them to focus on the green markers and try to keep them at the same height. Now in the study I did, the green markers were actually kind of further out here, but in this study by Wolf, the green markers were just right in front of your feet. So you would find a standing spot and they would put 2 green pieces of tape right in front of your toes. Now something I should add here, you're not actually looking at your feet or looking at those green markers. Everyone was instructed and we checked that they looked straight ahead. So everyone's looking ahead, but you're thinking about or focusing on, your feet or those green stickers. There's a control group as well, and they were told, yes, keep the platform horizontal, but they weren't given any focus of instruction, any focus of attention instructions. And we wanted to see here, well, what would be the default focus when we don't tell you to do internal or external? Here are the results. So we've got 2 days of acquisition or practice, and what we're looking at now is error. So the lower the score, the better. And no one can do this perfectly. No one can hold the platform exactly at 0 because there's a little bit of wobbling that occurs. So perfect performance would be kind of off the chart down even lower. But what we can see is we've got the 3 groups. Everyone starts out quite bad at the task. They're hitting the sides, flopping around. It's quite difficult. I wish I had a video of myself doing this. But with a little bit of practice over that first day, there's a big improvement in performance. We bring people back on day 2, and they've retained some of their abilities. They don't start as bad as they were, and we see that performance continues to improve. When we look at the stats here, by the end of day 1 and day 2, we can see visibly and statistically that this group here, the black squares, this is the group with the external focus of attention instructions, they have better performance than the internal group, so the circles here, open circles, and open circles is control, open squares is internal. So it looks like you have better performance with an external focus of attention. And interestingly, control and internal were comparable. And this kind of matches our expectations that we like as coaches to give internal focus of attention instructions, and as athletes we like to use internal focus of attention instructions. So when we don't tell you what to use, it seems that we like to default to an internal focus of attention. However, performance was statistically and actually quite clearly better with an external focus of attention. And when I've done these studies, when we bring people in on day 2, you can tell those that have practiced with an external focus of attention, this performance is visibly clearly better than the performance of an internal or a control group. So performance is better, but what about learning? So what we do to measure learning is we bring them back for day 3, and day 3, this is considered kind of a whole day of retention. So day 3 is our retention, and the pattern really just continues. So everyone is still getting a bit better at this task because they're practicing it. But the important thing is that now the external group still has better performance, which we can now conclude as better learning, because we're now doing retention, so the idea is we've eliminated those temporary performance factors. So we have better learning with an external focus of attention than internal, and also control and internal were comparable. All right, let's summarize these results. So an external focus of attention, although these aren't the typical instructions we give athletes and clients and patients, the weird thing is that they're clearly better. They improve performance, which is good, and more importantly, they improve learning. So this was a huge deal because of the prevalence of internal focus of instructions in sports and physical therapies and almost any setting you can think of. So for some reason, we like to give internal instructions even though they're clearly not the best. You might be wondering though, how does this apply to other things? And there's actually been a surprisingly huge amount of research on this topic. They've done all sorts of balance tasks. These are all examples of balance tasks. Many with that stabilometer or that stability platform, the one we saw in the picture, but also just balance on an inflated disc. Biodex is kind of like a way to test your balance. Balancing a stick, so like on your hand. Kind of regardless of how we look at balance, an external focus of attention is better for performance and learning. But what about sports, right? Does this apply to golf or to volleyball or to soccer or to juggling or to playing piano? And there's tons of studies on this. I mean, almost pick any sport and there's probably at least one study on it. And what they found, overwhelmingly, is that an external focus of attention is always more beneficial. And this is surprising because they're not the type of instructions we usually give athletes, and they're not the type of instructions athletes normally use. But I think understanding of this is starting to grow, and Professor Wolf actually published these guidelines of instructions to coaches in the NCAA, and part of that was promoting the use of external focus of instruction, external focus of attention instructions. Ooh, let's look at one example here. Let's look at force production. And this is a bit of a different study. It's not a learning study, but we are going to see a benefit to external focus. And they're looking specifically at jumping. Now, Professor Wolf was involved in this study, but so was Professor Dufek, hopefully I'm pronouncing that properly, both at the University of Nevada at Las Vegas. And Professor Dufek is actually a biomechanist. And I thought I'd focus on this one because myself and our biomechanist, Dr. John Harry, we also did a jumping study with internal and external focus of attention instructions. Ours was a little different, but we did replicate what they found. So in this study, we have a group of participants, and we're going to ask them to jump and touch as high as possible on the vertex. And we're going to have them do this a few times. And on half the trials, we're going to tell them to focus internally. So concentrate on the tips of your finger. And the other half of the trials, we'll tell them to focus externally. Concentrate on the rungs of the vertex. And just like before, it almost doesn't seem like this tiny difference in instruction should have any difference at all. You know, what does it matter if I tell you to focus on the tips of your finger or the rungs of the vertex? And that's one surprising thing about these focus of attention studies, is that just a tiny change in the instructions, you know, 1 or 2 words, and we see a big effect on performance and learning. Now, this study was not learning, so people just came in and did this once, so we're not going to see as big of an effect, but what they did find was a significant difference in jump height. So these are the same athletes doing both conditions, and when they focus internally, they jump, let's say, about 31 centimeters, and they focus externally, they jump about 33. Now you might be thinking, 2 centimeters, not a big deal. And you're right. You know, this isn't going to suddenly make people be able to dunk with an external focus of attention. But if this were a learning study, the idea is that this could potentially grow this difference over time. And the other thing is that, you know, 2 centimeters might not be relevant to your everyday athlete, but to an NFL player going into the combine, to be able to just think a little bit differently about how they perform the jumping task and jump 2 centimeters higher could be relevant to, you know, beating a few more athletes and ranking higher in the combine. So they found that yes, kind of as you would predict from knowledge in this area, that you can jump higher with an external focus of attention. But with a biomechanist, they wanted to go further and say, well, how? How are they jumping higher? And one thing they looked at was muscle activity. So we've got the amount of EMG activity from your tibialis anterior, bicep femoris, vastus lateralis, rectus femoris, and the lateral gastroc. So muscles of the legs. And black bars are internal focus, and the gray bars here are external. And the interesting thing, for almost all the muscles, there is less activity in with an external focus of attention. Lateral gastroc was actually comparable. So this is weird, because you would think, how do I jump higher? Well, I produce more muscle activity. And they found the opposite. Participants are jumping higher with less muscle activity. So what was their explanation for this? Well, they hypothesized that an external focus attention allowed participants to jump more efficiently. And one thing, the efficiency of jumping, is we need to have an optimal amount of co-contraction. So as we're jumping, you know, we need to be stable, and we don't need our bodies flopping all over the place. So there has to be some co-contraction to, you know, handle all that force we're producing in our legs. But if there's too much co-contraction, so if you imagine this is my leg and I'm co-contracting too much, well, that's going to be problematic for force production. So there's some sort of optimal level of co-contraction. And because they saw less EMG activity in the external group, they thought, well, maybe there's less co-contraction and they're jumping higher because they're jumping more efficiently. And this is interesting because, again, we just say a couple of words different, and we've affected not only how high they can jump, but, you know, their overall muscle activity, which is surprising. It's almost magic, if you will. So have we seen this in other tasks besides jumping? Yes. you become more efficient with an external focus of attention on many activities. So how long can you wall sit for? Well, if you focus externally, you'll be able to sit for longer than internally. Let's see, what standing long jump is better with an external focus attention. Sprinting, and this one's kind of fascinating. I'm trying to remember the instructions. I think they had them focus on the finish line, which is external, versus focus on force production of their legs, which is internal. And you're faster with an external focus of attention. So this applies, very broadly to all sorts of activities and tasks. The question remaining, although we still see studies that look at new sports, new activities, but really we want to know now why. Why is an external focus of attention better? And the best explanation we have so far is from Professor Wolf herself. And she suggests that an internal focus induces a conscious type of control, causing individuals to constrain their motor interference by interfering with automatic control processes. So for jumping, internal focus caused too much co-contraction and interfered with the efficiency of the motor system. An external focus promotes a more automatic mode of control by utilizing unconscious fast and reflexive control processes. And this is called the constrained action hypothesis. And it's a partial explanation, but it's not a full mechanistic explanation of how this works. There is good support for the constrained action hypothesis. So we see reduced attention capacity demands with an external focus. We see higher frequency movement adjustments in balance tasks when you have an external focus. And somewhat similar to reaction time, we see reduced pre-movement time with an external focus. So there is some evidence for the constrained action hypothesis, but this is an interesting area for future research. All right, let's look at a second aspect of motor learning. Here the question is, what is the best way to distribute practice? And this applies to learning a motor skill like skateboarding, but it also applies to learning content in a course like studying. So hopefully this section will actually help improve your study habits as well. So let's imagine you've got 6 hours to study for an upcoming test. How should you distribute those 6 hours? Maybe you are going to spend 6 hours in one day. We call this mass practice. So you kind of do it all at once, or you have the shortest time interval for all of your practice. Now, if we want to extend that practice, we call this distributed practice. An example of this would be studying 2 hours a day for 3 days. So both, you're going to have 6 hours total practice because we want to have a fair comparison, but one is more massed, you get it done in a day. One is more distributed, you get it done in 3 days. Now there is a continuum here, this is relative. So we could be even more distributed. You could study 1 hour a day for 6 days. So there's always more or less extreme examples of massed and distributed. But we're going to pick 2 points on this continuum in different studies and look at the effect that has. So here's a study by Professor Shea, who used to be a professor in kinesiology at Texas A&M. And actually I think the next study we look at will also be a study from Professor Shea. He's a famous motor learning researcher. So in this task, they focused on a motor skill, and they picked something kind of simple so that this could be done in the lab and it wouldn't take months of practice. This is something people can get better at in just a couple of days of practice. So what they did is they had them on a number key of a keyboard, practice pressing 2, 4, 8, and then 6. To make this a little harder, because that's pretty easy, not much learning would happen for a young adult who knows how to press a keyboard already, there were timing requirements. So the time from pressing 2 to 4 needed to be 200 milliseconds, and then 4 to 8 was twice as slow, it needed to be 400 milliseconds, and then the time from, 8 to 6 was kind of in the middle, it had to be 300 milliseconds. So participants would practice this, they would do a trial, and then they would get feedback on a computer screen that would say how well they did the timing. And that allowed them to be like, oh, I'm too fast, I'm too slow, oh, this 2 to 4 is good, but 4 to 8 is bad, allowed them to get better at this task. So we've got two groups. One is more massed and one is more distributed, but we'll get to that in just a moment, because at first they do 3 sessions right in a row, and there's actually no difference between these two groups. So what we're measuring here is total error. So if you do this perfectly, your total error would be 0. This is hard, so no one ever gets to perfect performance on this task. But we can see on these first 3 test sessions, done back to back, that they start off with poor performance and they get better. This makes sense. You practice, your performance improves. Each of these sessions actually had 108 trials to give you an idea of how many times they're pressing these keys. Here's where we're going to see the difference between our groups. What we do is there's now a break in practice, and for the group here with circles, they are going to take 10 minutes off. So they do 3 blocks, take a break for 10 minutes, and they come back and they do their next 3 blocks. And that is relatively more massed. The distributed group here in squares, they again do 3 blocks, but then we give them a 24-hour break. So that is more distributed. So the more massed group here in circles, they actually do the first 3 sessions all in one day. So they're more massed because they do all the practice in one day. The other group with squares, it's going to take them 3 days because they get 24 hours off between sessions. So we're looking at performance still. Day 2, day 3, people continue to improve at this task, which makes sense as you practice. But we can see by day 2, there's a significant and a big visible difference between the performance of these groups. And remember, the lower the performance, the better, because we're talking about error. So what we're seeing here is that the more distributed group has way better performance than the more massed group. So that's good, but what about retention? We want to know, what is learning, so we're going to now look at retention. So for both of the groups, so to conclude, we've got better performance for distributed practice compared to mass practice, but we really want to know who has better motor learning, so we're going to look at retention. So both groups come back 24 hours later after their last block of acquisition, and now we can measure their motor learning. And we still see that, yes, the more distributed group has better learning than the more massed group. So to summarize, distributed practice is better than mass practice for performance and for learning. There's kind of no, well, I was going to say there's no reason not to use distributed practice, but there is a good reason we'll get to in just a second. This has also been shown for many motor skills. I used to talk about a famous study where they did javelin, which is maybe more sport related than pressing keys on a number pad. And this has also been shown for studying, for cognitive tasks. So if you only have 3 hours to study for a test, yes, studying 3 hours at once, massed, is good and you will learn. But if you can distribute that, maybe 1 hour a day over 3 days, you will learn more. It will be more efficient. Now, why do we not always distribute practice, even though it's more efficient? Well, there's the practical issue of time. So to distribute practice, we need more time, and we don't always have the luxury of time. So if you have a test tomorrow, well, you've got no option but to mass your studying. You can't say, I'm going to split this over a week because the test is tomorrow. Here's another way to look at it. So let's pretend we've got 2 groups practicing javelin, and everyone's going to do 15 sessions. Let's see, 3, 6, 9, 12. Yeah, great. So everyone's going to do 15 sessions of practice. First, we have our more distributed group. They practice 3 times a week. So it's going to take them roughly a month to get in their 15 sessions. Now our more mass group, they're going to practice 5 times a week. And it's only going to take them 3 weeks to get in their 15 sessions. Now if we compare learning with, say, a retention test here to here, so we're going to be fair, we're going to say each group got 15 sessions, we will see better learning in the more distributed group, just like we saw in that past study. But we need to remember that this mass group has saved time. They have saved 2 weeks where they could continue to practice. So if this group, with their time savings, sneaks in 10 more test sessions, and then we compare everyone on, I guess what would be June 1st here. So yes, the distributed group only got 15 sessions, the mass group got in 25 sessions. I predict that even though distributed practice is better, relatively better, because this group got in 10 more sessions, that they would probably have better learning. So that's why we don't always see completely distributed practice, because it's also a matter of getting those hours in. And that's why athletes, elite athletes, don't just practice once a week to be super distributed, or once a month. They might practice twice a day. So yes, it's good to distribute practice, but time is a limiting factor. All right, one more topic in motor learning. And this one is maybe even more realistic to sports contexts. And the question here is when you need to learn multiple skills. So this is true of some sports. So volleyball, great example. You need to know how to pass, set, and spike. Other sports, that's not the case. If you are a javelin athlete, you throw the javelin. You only have one thing to practice. But lots of sports, or within industry, there's lots of motor skills you need to learn. And how should you practice when you need to learn multiple skills? One idea is to do blocked practice. And here you're going to practice one skill at a time. And if you think back to maybe when you were an athlete, or if you're still an athlete and when you practiced, you can probably remember drills where it was blocked. So I remember playing volleyball and the coach would say, okay, we're going to practice on passing. We're going to do just passing. We're going to focus on that. We'll do 10 passes. Okay, now we'll do 10 sets. We'll focus on that. And then we'll do 10 spikes. So that's block practice, one skill at a time. And I think there's some intuitive reasons why that might be best for learning. You can focus on one thing at a time, focus on it, dedicate it to it, really perfect that skill. Oh, so here's our block practice example. Yeah, we'll do 10 passes, 10 sets, 10 spikes. Great. The opposite end is random practice. So to be fair, we're going to have the same number of trials, 30 total trials. It'll be 10 of each skill, but we're never going to do the same task twice in a row. So it'll be some sort of random order. So maybe we do a pass. That's not a pass. Okay, I guess it doesn't follow. Sorry. Maybe we do a spike, we do a pass, we do a set, and then a spike, and then a set, and then a pass. You do a random order for these 30 trials. And I think we could come up with some logical explanations for why this would be better for learning. Maybe it's because it's more like the game. When you're playing volleyball, you typically don't know at any given time, do I need to pass, set, or spike? It depends on what's happening in the game. So maybe this is better for learning. So here's another experiment by Shea, our famous motor learning scientist from Texas A&M. A very fundamental experiment, motor learning, but has been reproduced and replicated in more sports-like contexts. But again, we're looking at a very kind of controlled lab-based experiment. So like volleyball, we have participants learning 3 different tasks, but they're timing tasks. And what you would do in this task is you get a warning signal, and then one of these 3 lights would turn on, and depending on which light, you would have to do either the bump, the set, or the spike. But what the actual task is, you pick up this tennis ball, and let's say the first light you have to knock down this wall, and this wall. So you knock it down with the tennis ball, and you put the ball back in the hole. And we're measuring how quickly you can do that. And if this light turned on, then there would be a different sequence of movements to make. Maybe you would have to hit down this wall, and then that wall. And then if this light came on, it would be a third different movement. And maybe it's, let's say, this wall, and that wall. So there's 3 different movements you're practicing. We're going to have one group who will do blocked practice. They do 18 trials of the first movement, 18 trials of the second movement, and 18 trials of the third movement. We have a random group. They will never do the same movement twice in a row. So they're going to have to focus on the light because, I guess if this one turned on, the next trial it's going to be that one or that one. But they don't know. They have to look at the light and then switch and do that task as quickly as possible. But again, we're equating the same number of trials. There's 56 total trials for both groups, 18 on each task. Ooh, and to be very thorough, this is our first study where we'll see retention and transfer. This makes things complicated, but we'll break it down one step at a time. So first, acquisition. Who has better performance? Well, we're looking at your total response time, or your reaction time plus movement time, and the goal is to be as fast as possible. So the lower the total response time, the better. When participants start at this task, they're not very good, and then with practice, performance improves. More importantly, we see far better performance in the block group. So, even on that first block, the first trials would likely be the same, but by the end of the first block, the average performance is way better for that block group. So this is interesting. It suggests that, well, maybe we want to practice block because that's better for performance. But remember, we need to look at retention and transfer to see who has better learning. This is where things get a little complicated. So, if we look over here at these 4 groups, what the first letter means is what they practiced during acquisition. So B down here, this means that they practice blocked. So they practice blocked, and let's pretend there's 20 participants in this group. 10 of them then went here, and 10 of them went here. And what the second letter tells us is what they did during retention and transfer. R means that they now do random, and let's go back here. And B means that they kept doing blocked. So these participants, they all practice blocked, and then half of them during retention and transfer do random, and the other half of them during retention and transfer do blocked. We have the same sort of split for the other group. So here everyone practices random, and then retention and transfer 10 minutes, 10 days later. Half of them are still doing random, and half of them are now doing blocked. So a little complicated, but there's really 2 comparisons we're going to break out here. So first, let's look at people who practice random, people who practice blocked, and 10 minutes and 10 days later, both groups are going to do random. So we're comparing kind of this amount of performance, which we can conclude is learning, to this amount of learning. And who has better learning? Well, this group. And the interesting thing here is that this is our random group. So practicing random, you have bad performance, but you have better learning. That's weird, right? That's a paradox. It's counterintuitive. And remember, performance is not what we want to achieve. We want to learn as much as possible. So bad performance is actually okay if it leads to better learning. The other comparison we can make are these 2 groups. So this group, again, practice random. This group practice blocked, but now everyone's doing blocked to kind of be fair. And we can see it's not as big as before, but there's still better learning for the group that practice random. So this is kind of fascinating. It's been shown many times that block practice has better performance, but random practice has better learning. And remember, learning is far more important. So why is this? So we call this a counterintuitive paradox. You have worse practice and better learning. Why? First of all, just an aside here, this is why it's hard to be a coach. So let's say you're coaching and you've got 2 athletes and you've set up this little experiment and you say, okay, this golfer, I want you to practice block. Take 10 shots to this hole and then this hole, 10, kind of like 10 sets, 10 passes, 10 spikes, but it's going to be, use your wood for 10 trials to this hole and then use your pitching wedge 10 trials for this hole, so blocked. And then this golfer on the team, you're going to say practice random. Every trial, go to a different hole, get a different club, and practice that way. And if you sit back as the coach and watch, you're going to see this random person who's practicing randomly has a horrible performance. They suck. Or they look, let's say normally these 2 golfers are equivalent, but now his performance looks horrible and his performance looks great. And you might say, aha, we should always practice blocked because it's better for performance. But what we're missing is retention and transfer. And if you then took these golfers and put them in a competition, put them in a tournament, the one who practiced random would actually have better learning and should outperform the one that practiced block. And this is a challenge for coaches because a lot of coaches don't know that performance is equal to temporary performance factors plus learning, unless we're talking about retention and transfer, which is critical for making these comparisons between groups. So aside from the practical implications, let's get back to answering why random practice has poor performance and better learning. Let's start with an analogy. So the explanation for this is the Reconstruction Hypothesis, but let's think about it in terms of practicing multiplication tables. Let's say I've got one group, we're going to do random practice. So we're going to do just 6 trials, just keep it simple. And each trial is a different multiplication. So if I timed everyone doing this, we're going to be slow, right? It's going to take a little bit of time for each one to get the answer. So slow performance here, we can think of this as like bad performance. But we're going to learn from this. Doing all these different multiplications, and you can think about 100 trials instead, will help us learn. So random practice on multiplication tables, you're going to have poor performance. It's going to take you time to do this, but that's what's going to cause learning. What if we did block practice? What if I gave you 7 times 5, 6 times a row, or even 100 times in a row? Well, you're going to be very fast at answering this, right? Because only the first trial do you actually have to solve 7 times 5. You're like, oh, 7 times 5, 35. Great. Took a few seconds to solve that. But you see it again, you're like, well, it's still 35. I already solved that. So you're going to be really fast here. It'd be fun to do this as a class to split up, but it should be dead obvious. This group is going to be slow, this group is going to be fast. So here we're going to see good performance, but you don't learn very much from this. You really only learn from that first trial, and now you're just kind of copying and pasting that answer that's left over in working memory. Let's apply this to actual motor skills. So first of all, let's think, how do we produce an action? And we're going to think about it in terms of 4 steps. So first, when we want to do a movement, let's say a volleyball pass, we have to get that generalized motor program out of our procedural long-term memory. That goes into our working memory so that we can use it. But we need to set the parameters of our generalized motor program specific to the task. And then once we've done that, we can go ahead and execute that generalized motor program. So there's 4 steps. One assumption here is that we can only hold one generalized motor program in working memory at a time. And if I'm holding a pass generalized motor program and I need to do a spike, I'm going to have to get rid of the pass and load in the spike generalized motor program. Let's think about this in terms of random practice. Okay, let's say we'll go with volleyball still, and I need to do a spike. Well, I got to load my generalized motor program, or retrieve it from long-term memory, put it in working memory, set the parameters, and execute it. I'm going to go through all 4 steps. And that takes time, just like solving a new multiplication question. So performance will be slow. Now it's random, so the next trial, oh, now I need to pass. Okay, get rid of spike, get the pass generalized motor program, put it in working memory, set the parameters, and now execute it. I'm always doing these 4 steps. That takes time. That is going to have poor performance. But it's precisely going through these 4 steps over and over that causes motor learning. So poor performance, but better motor learning. Let's think about blocked. So now I'm just doing a whole block of spikes. So I need to do a spike. Okay, get the spike generalized motor program, put it in working memory, set the parameters, and execute. So that takes time, and I'll learn from it. But trial 2 comes, oh, that's already in working memory. I've already set the parameters. Maybe I tweak them, maybe not, but I can go ahead and execute it. So I'm saving time. I might only do step 4, maybe step 3 and 4. And that, the time savings will, or the savings of steps makes it have good performance, but because I'm not going through all 4 steps every time, I'm not learning very much. And we call this the Reconstruction Hypothesis. So how do we learn? It's from going through, that timely, difficult, or I guess to say time-consuming, difficult process of going through those 4 steps. Doing those requires effort. It's poor performance, but doing that is exactly what causes learning. So random practice, we have to reconstruct the generalized motor program on every trial. Bad for performance, good for learning. Block practice, we get that generalized motor program constructed on the first trial, and then we just keep using it. It's good for performance, but it's bad for learning. That's been our module on motor learning. So I encourage you to study as well as possible for this last module. Check out the practice questions, and when you're ready, good luck on the test.